and welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 130. So today I'm going to be talking about some photography I did, emergency photography, for Slipware potters Fitch and McAndrew. Now, some of you may remember that I've photographed them before, but it wasn't product photography I was doing then. At that point I was photographing the makers in action, which is much more the kind of photography I do. But this time they needed some of their pottery, their jugs and pots and what have you, photographed, ready for their online exhibition. So I'm going to be talking you through that, because product photography isn't my natural place to be. So I thought you might find it interesting if I talk you through the process of what I did to take the photos. Plus, later on in the programme, we'll be talking about critique, and I'll also be telling you what's coming up next week. So here we are, live on YouTube, unless you happen to be watching the recording, in which case make sure you subscribe somewhere down there and click the little notification bell to make sure that you're kept up to date with new podcasts as and when they happen. If you are watching live, then leave me a comment. Let me know where you are. Say hello. Let me know what the weather's like. Get the chat going. In fact, I can see the chat is already going. So Jack says, hope everyone is doing great today. Wishes from Florida. Pat says, hi all from a bright but chilly Somerset. April says, hi everyone from a cold and sunny Long Island, New York. Wish I was in Jack's state till May. Cold up in the north part of America then, and warm in Florida, hopefully. Lisa says, hi from Madrid, sunny as usual. Oh, that's rather nice. Meg says, hello everyone. Maggie says, getting colder in southwest Scotland, and it is indeed. I do have to agree with that one. Peter says, hello all from a cold but sunny Annan in Dumfries and Galloway. Photo Bizarre, that's Robert and Anne from Texas say howdy all from a cold North Texas. Andy says hello from a rainy Herefordshire. And Stacey says good morning, cold and windy here. Sorry I've been gone for a while. Stacey's in Hatboro, Pennsylvania. And VG says good evening all, because of course it's evening over in India. Morning in the US and afternoon in the UK and most of Europe, I think. Right. So, great, we have people here, we have conversation, we have pictures to look at, we have critique to come. Stay tuned. Great, okay, so, yes, so what I'm going to talk about today then is I thought I would talk about Fitch and McAndrew. So, they are Slipware potters. They're a lovely, lovely couple. I've shown their photography before, where a couple of years back I did some makers type photography with them. So I went round there and photographed them making pots and doing the decorations and everything from sort of shots of them kind of standing back at work through to kind of close-up hands covered in clay kind of thing. And I talked about the lighting that I set up, and you can find that. But also, periodically I've used some of their photos to show other examples of photographic or compositional techniques. Just a couple of weeks ago, when I was talking about the notion of containment, I used the photo of Doug Fitch there with his pot, and the notion of how the shape of it was keeping your eye within the photo. So if you missed that, after this, go take a little bit, look a couple of shots back from that, a couple of episodes back, and you'll find out what that was about. Now, the thing is, as you know, people are my speciality. But in fact, actually following on from the reason that I did the makers shoot for Fitch and McAndrew a few years ago, was because every year, this time of year, they have an annual online exhibition. And this year's no different. So currently on there, if you look up Fitch and McAndrew, or just type that into Google, or actually fitchandmcandrew.co.uk, I think is their web address. I'll make sure I put it into the description down here if I haven't done so already. Then they've currently got their online exhibition. Go and check out their work. They've got amazing stuff, and if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you can also buy. They have customers from all over the world, and I do know they ship out to the States because some of the stuff they've sold, they've already mentioned doing so. So what had happened was that I don't usually do their product photography. There's another photographer who does that, but what had happened in between their usual product photographer, photographing most of their pots ready for the online exhibition, and suddenly and at the start of the online exhibition, they'd made a few more pots, but their usual photographer was away on holiday, so they desperately needed a few more pieces done. So I got a phone call pleading with me to come in and do some shots, and I thought, well, okay, I've talked about product photography on here, I know the principles of it, I've done little bits here and there. I'd not done that kind of stuff before, but I thought, okay, let's give it a go. Let's go and apply the principles that I already know. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk you through a sort of setup from like my first test shots to then how we built the background, and then I'll show you the final edited pieces. So I'll give you a sense of what was going on with that. But feel free to ask questions and leave comments as we go, and I'll periodically check in and see if I can answer them. In fact, actually, I can see that there's a couple more here. No, Stacey says she's been lately watching some interesting podcasts on the history of the 30s and 40s. Very compelling. Well, as long as you're not watching them instead of this, then that's fine. Rosemary says, good morning, one and all. Hope everyone is staying warm. Not overly much, Jack. Chilly but sunny here in Washington State. Stacey says, I do love product photography, would like some pointers. Right, okay, so what am I going to do here? Let me... So first of all, I'll tell you what, what do I need to do? I need to do that. I need to do that. And what I will do is I will show you this photo. This photo... Nope, not that one. That one. There we go. Here we go, 130 episodes in. I still get confused about which button to press. So this is the photo that I've been using to advertise the forthcoming, well, this podcast. And what I'm trying to show you here is the setup that I used. And basically, in fact, maybe I'll come back to this one because it will make more sense once I've actually talked you through some of the photos. So what I will do is I will start off. So the main thing to get out of this bit, first of all, here is that we decided to use one of the workbenches here, and to shoot onto the corner of the workbench. Now, this photo is just taken in the ambient daylight with my phone. So fine for a little web pic, no good for printing up, but it does give you a sense of what the layout was that I was playing with. Now, realizing that it was very dark, what I decided I first of all took a quick shot in the there was a bit of light coming. Now, this is with camera at proper settings, like 100 ISO kind of thing. And what happened, a bit of light coming from the window off them, and to my left really wasn't showing up very much at all. So I then set up a softbox and shot that to sort of get a sense of what this would look like. And we've got a bit of light here, and the immediate problem that you're up against is reflections. This kind of slipware pottery, the glazes that Doug and Hannah use are very shiny. And so you can instantly see that we've got this light reflecting from the softbox coming straight onto the jug. The other thing is we've got the light coming from that side, and then it's all very, very kind of dark around the outside. So I then kind of put a bit more, I needed a sort of brighter, more powerful. We took the softbox back a little bit. I changed the angle, and what I then did was I put a reflector on the other side. So my main light is coming in from this kind of left here, and then I've got a reflector over on the right, which actually if I put here, you'll see there. You see I've put a reflector over on the other side in order to make sure that I'm bouncing some light back in and filling in all of that shadow, because we go back to here, as you can see, it's very dark. And what's really important here is that we're getting the full shape of the pot. We can't just have it. And I suppose in a way there's a kind of an interesting thing here, which is because of the kind of portrait photography I do, I like going dark and moody. That's my default. Unless I'm given instructions not to, I will always default to a kind of dark and moody. And dark and moody jugs, while making them very interesting, don't necessarily show off the jugs as they should be. Anyway, so having sort of got, well, okay, we've sort of got a light, but essentially we don't want to have this door in the background, and there's a very dull, background here. So we need to start building it up. So what I then did was I switched over, I just put it on, I essentially switched the lights off, just went to ambient light. There's overhead lights. I've got ISO 5000 or something like that, just in order to make sure that I can get a sense of the shape of what's going on. So at this point now, what we're doing is we're building the set rather than worrying specifically about getting the lighting right. I'll come back to the lighting. Now I want a high ISO with a natural light. You can start to see the window light reflecting in the glaze here. Although some of that window light is still bouncing off the reflector. So we started to sort of stack a few things in the background, and we can see there's sort of a few bits here, but they're maybe not quite as much as we want. I changed my angle slightly, and there we go. We start to kind of build up, put some more bits and pieces. We've got these boards over here, stacking them up. We've got a pot over here. We've angled the handle so that it's pointing towards the jug to act as that kind of leading line. So as your eye drifts over to the right, you've got a line pointing you back into it, in that notion of containment again. And then I go back to the idea of putting the lights on. Now we've got this sort of shape and bit on the background, and I put the light on, gone back to the lighting, but at this point it's kind of too strong. The back part of this, we're losing a bit of definite, it's not as clear as it could be. And what I'm also very aware of at this point is just how much light is hitting this board down on the edge of the table, on the left here. It's very, very bright, and lots of light over here. It's kind of just drawing too much attention away. So at this point then I decided I've got to rebalance the light. I take another reflector that I've got, and actually what I then did was I put it in between the light. So you can see the light coming over on the left now. It's like there's a shadow across here. Some of the light's coming through and grabbing the bottom bit, and there's a little bit grabbing the corner there. But to go back to this one, what I've got here is I'm using another reflector that I've got, but actually just using it to literally block off. Now I've not got it at that angle, we changed that so it's a bit lower, but I'm actually using it to block off the light. And here you can see then in the back of the camera exactly what I've just shown you here, which is that there's shadow now falling onto here. So there's not as much light hitting the front part, and it allows the light to be more directional to land on the pot, onto the jug itself. Hope that makes sense. So this is what we've got. This is the unedited version. It's a case of, is it too dark around here? Do I need to sort of play around a little bit more with the reflector? And I'm sort of making a couple of light adjustments to this, and I think I make one more. Yes, now you can notice the difference between that and that. So I'm kind of balancing out the light a little bit more until what I've got here is, I know that when I come to edit this, I can just lighten the jug, try and keep the background darker, and then the light will be much more balanced. Whereas this, it's just kind of a bit too bright on this side and a bit too dark on the right. So now I've got that, I can then edit it, and this is what the final edited piece looks like. So that then gives you an idea of the sort of sequence of events. So from that then, what I did was, what I'll do now then is I'll run you through some of the pieces to give you a sense of, so much of this kind of stuff, everything is in getting the first one right. And then from then on, you're more or less repeating, except for the fact that it wasn't quite like that, because what I found was each of the pots was slightly different. They were different sizes. They had maybe, they've got 3 different kinds of glaze. They've got a kind of a greenish glaze, a yellowish glaze, in fact 4 really, because there's a kind of an orangey brown, and then there's a kind of darker brown glaze that they've got, and then different sizes, and then different slight shapes. And so actually with each one the light was reflecting differently. Having said that, having got the main setup right, what it was then about was going click, tweaking, and making sure that I was adjusting the light for for the particular pieces. So let me just show you a couple of extra ones then. So we have this kind of jug here, which is slightly different from the other one I showed you. Then we have this one again. Now, you know, different shape, different markings, different color, glazes. This one now this one, Doug had done 2 or 3 of these. I can't remember exactly why, but there's a whole kind of bearded jug phenomenon. I don't know. I think the style of this dates back several centuries. Maybe it's a sort of early form of Toby jug, not entirely sure. But this idea of sort of actually building the face into the jug is something that's been around, I think, since at least medieval Britain. And a lot of Doug's style of pottery, and Hannah as well, they hark back to take reference from traditional style pottery from a few centuries ago. Here's another one, bearded jug, entirely different shape, but you know, there's still the same kind of principle with it. A lot of fun with these. And then he'd done this, and this was like one of the major pieces. Now, just to give you a sense of the size of this one's much taller. Again, if I go back to this, if you look at the boards, it's stacked up in the background. Here I'm lower down, and the height of this, even though it's sitting on a couple of boards, is still below that part. This one here, this money box with birds, is, you can see now, sitting considerably higher. So there's much more height to this. And so triple thing, that is a money box, so you can pop your coins into there. But sorry, come back to there. And but it's also got all these little birds on it, and these birds also play sounds. They are whistles. So if you look in here, you can see a little mouthpiece. So you can actually blow into those. And if you go to the Fitch and McAndrew website and go and take a look at their catalogue online for this exhibition, you'll come across this piece. But there's also a little video taken from when before it was glazed, but Doug was sort of still making the little birds and sort of putting it together, and he starts blowing through several of these. And then this top one up here then actually has a little hole in the front which you can put your finger over. So essentially it gives you 2 notes, and so you can blow it and you can kind of put your finger on and off, and it's like hearing a cuckoo sound, getting the 2 different pitches. So you've got this money box, but you've got all these birds here as well. And a little, so I took this one from a couple of different angles. Again, like I said, once you've got the setup, it's easier to kind of keep it going. Here you can see it from behind. Here you can see it again. You can blow into the tail of the bird in order to get the sounds you want. But also, I think with these ones, you get quite a nice sense of the background here, looking like a kind of a busy pottery studio. And that's part of the thing with some of these so different kinds of product photography when it comes to this. This year, their usual product photographer had done that. Most of their jugs have been a much more neutral kind of, a kind of plain, well, not completely plain, but a sort of slightly textured background, a textured base, but there wasn't really any background as such. But we decided that for these ones that I was going to photograph, we wanted to sort of have slightly more of a sense of a context. So it's not just a case of here's a jug or here's a money box, but here it is in the studio where it's being made. So always understand that with product photography, that the background you select is also going to have an impact on the narrative of the image. Here's a little close-up of one of the birds, and in fact, actually, and here's a close-up of the cuckoo at the top. But birds also, these ones I don't think you can blow through. But again, it's not uncommon for Doug's done various pieces where he will make these little birds and then create these kind of elaborate lids to go on pieces. And sometimes I think there was a point where he was doing these, and he got a few birds left over, and so then made these little kind of little tree stumps as well, where with the birds on, a little style again glazed in a slightly different way. And then there was one last piece that now he didn't need me to photograph the whole piece. There was this sort of big, I've forgotten what it's called, but it's like it's a giant kind of pot, but it's got loads of handles all around the edge. Wish I could remember what it's called. Anyway, but he'd done a very elaborate piece with birds on the top. But into the birds, he'd put a little cat. And it was a case of trying to photograph it so that you could then see, here you go, here's the cat here, like, you know, the cat among the pigeons, I suppose, but, you know, like sneaking up to try and get this bird on the top. So there's a lot of elaborate detail in here, and sometimes these little things get lost, and these things, again, are not always easy. It took me quite a while to, we're sort of moving this around and moving the lights around so I could get to a point whereby the cat would show up, not be lost in the shadow, but also not just be lost completely in all the detail that's going in. So that's really kind of what I wanted to show you, just to kind of give you that idea of how you can kind of play around. I think a conversation I was having with Maggie about the way that I approach product photography, which she said, well, you kind of I approach my product photography like portrait photography. So I do portraits of products, which I thought was kind of interesting and probably very accurate. Likewise, I have seen so-called portrait photographers who essentially go to portraits in the way they do product photography. So they're more or less product photographers, and they photograph people like products. And that's a different kind of photography again. That's not really telling you anything much about the personality. Whereas I lit these, I photographed them in a not dissimilar way than the way I would quite like to kind of photograph a face. So there was a certain amount of portraiture of products in there. So hopefully you found that interesting. Just that thought, again, the main thing to remember when you're doing product photography, you've got to get it lit, and you've got to also make sure that the product itself is the star, and you don't get too caught up in the idea of deep, dark, moody shadows as I do, and that I had to make sure that it was lit enough so that the whole product was showing up as a product. But also remember that, as I've talked before about the idea that anything else is in the photo also adds to or detracts from the narrative. So you can either have it, say, against a plain wall or a neutral background, or if you're having something else in it, like parts of the workshop, you have to understand that that's adding to it. And is that the story you want to add to it? And if it is, that's great. If it isn't, then you need to think again. Right, a couple more comments here. Where are we? John Harvey's joined us here from a very cold American Midwest. Stacey said I had a small box and decided to get 2 soft boxes and use a white coloured background, which is a muslin hanging off the frame. And she's got a friend who does pottery. So yeah, that's certainly a way you can do it. And I think that notion of 2 soft boxes, a lot of photography is done like that, and it allows you a kind of fairly even spread of light. So you're not too worried about deep shadows, because deep shadows can slightly distort your idea of what you think the shape is going to be. And so that, again, that difference with product photography is you tend to be looking for more overall kind of general full light rather than too much in the way of shadow. Andy says, with the level of detail in the pottery, the modelling with the strobe really brings out the detail better than the ambient light. Yeah, you've really got to, thanks Andy, but yes, you're right. You've really got to be careful, because the ambient light was a bit of daylight coming from window, which I couldn't control, or overhead strip lights, which are probably like the worst kind of light you can be using. That the least complementary. It might be very functional, but it's never very interesting in terms of light for photography. So you have to kind of arrange either your strobes or flashes and or reflectors, how you're going to kind of bounce that light to create around it. Stacey says, to April, all my shots have a white background. So yeah, that makes it easier to remove if you've got any imperfections, or put it into a different situation. April likes the bird lid. Fiji says the bird one looks unique, nicely captured. Stacey says they're also vintage, love all the details going on in the pottery and showing it accurately for advertising, not catalogue. Rosemary says so much to think about when setting up the stage for products. Lisa says, I really like the choice of background. And Maggie says, a contextual background works much better to give a sense of the piece, but I suppose, like with paintings, we need both. Yeah, and I think it is. There is... Product photography isn't really one kind of thing, just like portraiture isn't one. You know, portraits, you can do portraits against a plain white background, or you can do environmental portraits, and there's so many sort of variations within that. Why would product photography be any different? It's not just, so you've got the background, you've got the lighting, and you've got the mood and the narrative that you're trying to tell as well. Russ has joined us. It says, first time I've managed to get here for weeks. I'm glad you could make it, Russ. You might have to, at the end of this, go back and hit rewind to see the bit. I've just finished talking about the pottery photography. So, okay. So, what else we get? So, thank you for feedback on that, and I hope you found that useful. So next up, I'm going to talk about the critique section in a moment. I've got two people sent in, both Robert and Andy have put in some really interesting images, which I'm looking forward to talking about. But before that, just a quick heads up about next week. Next week's podcast is, for those who haven't seen it yet, is the DIY photography equipment share, or exchange or whatever. So essentially, some of you may remember that last week I was talking about a little modifier that I created for the end of my flash. You can buy them and they'll cost you about £20, or I made one out of an old plastic business card box. And then following that, I think Rosemary got in contact with me and said, why don't you actually do a podcast on that idea of homemade DIY photography modifiers and equipment, but ask everybody else to either send in their own or to have a go. And I thought this was a brilliant idea, so I told you about this last week. For those of you who missed it, you can go and find in fact actually just on YouTube on here, check out next week's. There's a little bit of description in the video. It's sitting there waiting as ready to go live next week. Or you can go to the Facebook page, where I've set up a Facebook page about that. But in essence, what I would like you to do is, if you have a bit of DIY homemade photography equipment, then show us, share it with us. This is the thing, put it into the Facebook group, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, or email it to me, kim@kimayres.co.uk. Take a photo of the piece of equipment. Doesn't have to be a fancy photo, it can be a quick phone photo, and a photo of where you've used it, and a little description of how you made it, how you used it. Now this can be anything from a plastic cup to a sawn off milk carton. It could be a piece of board with a bit of tin foil on it. It could be candy wrappers that you've used for coloured gels over the end of a flash. I seem to remember one of the first modifiers I ever came across was when I started photography, was the flip up little light, the flash on the camera. Somebody said stick a cigarette paper over the end and it diffuses the light a little bit. So something as simple as cigarette paper can diffuse the light a bit. So if you've got anything like that, take a photo of it, show us a photo that you've taken using the modifier and tell us a little bit about it. If you haven't, go onto YouTube. Well, you're already on here, you're on YouTube. Wait till the podcast's over. But type into YouTube, photography modifiers, DIY equipment, these kind of words and phrases. And you will find thousands of videos out there on how to knock together your own bits and pieces. The thing is, we all love photography. We also know photography equipment can be very, very expensive, and yet very often you can get exactly the same, if not slightly better results from homemade kit. And some of that homemade kit can be as simple as putting a sheet across a window on a sunny day to diffuse the light. So anything that you've had a go at, show us. And if you haven't had a go to YouTube, look for something, try and find something that you think, oh, that's a bit of fun, I could do that. I've got a washing up bottle at home and a little bit of tape, and I'm going to give that a go and try it out, and then send us the result. So photograph of the piece of equipment itself that you've made, and a photo that was where that piece of equipment was used, and a little description of what it's all about. And then next week I'll gather these together and we'll go through and we'll have a little bit of fun and share each other's ideas and see what's possible, because I think I think it's a brilliant idea, and so thank you very much for suggesting it, Rosemary. I also had a couple of other people sort of make notes about the fact that they really quite like the fact that I showed this little kind of modified business card box. So I think it's something which is there for pretty much all of us as photographers, as we're trying to modify the light in some way, or modify our rig the camera, have it propped up in some particular way. What are your solutions? Everybody's incredibly inventive, and it'd be really fun to see what you can come up with. So that's your task for next week. Try and get your photos in by Friday, Saturday at the latest. Anything that turns up on Sunday, I'm afraid, probably won't make it in. Right, okay, what else have we got? Rosemary says, really excited for next week to see what clever things folks have created, and especially, Rosemary, as you're the one who suggested it, I expect to see something from you. Okay, oh right, yeah, John Harvey says looking forward to it next week. Excellent, good. So I know at least I've got 2 people who are going to be sending stuff in. Great, okay, so what we're going to do now is move on to the critique section. So this is your chance to send in images to the podcast. There's not many places you can get reasonable feedback on your images on the internet. You shove your pictures up on social media, friends will either like them or not like them. They don't necessarily give you any feedback, and even if they do, are they photographers who can give you accurate feedback? Not always. Most people don't really want to hurt your feelings either, so they'd rather say nothing or just say it's lovely without actually, because they don't want to say anything where you might take the huff with them. So this is your corner of the internet where you can send me your images and get genuine feedback, but in a nice and pleasant way. I'm not going to be nasty or snarky about it. But hopefully the whole idea of these podcasts is to help to improve your understanding of photography, to improve your own photography. So what we're going to do then is move on. And so let's start then. We're going to start with Robert. And so let me just find Robert's photo. And Robert sent in this image and said, I took this photo. Actually, is that the original? And is that the edited? Yeah, that's the original. That's the edited, I think. In fact, actually, I think. No, yes, that's the edited version, right? Okay, so as you can see that there's a very, he's just basically, he's brightened it up a little bit. But he said, I took this photo in Paris last February from a taxi in the morning. It was past golden hour, but the light was still good. Obviously, the composition is difficult from a moving cab, of a moving bicycle, but I rather like this shot. I must admit, actually, you wouldn't realise that both the cab and the bike were moving. It's got that, it's so sharp, it's so pin sharp, I can zoom in here and I can see we can make out, you can make out the zip, it hasn't even blurred on this. But then looking at your detail, your information, Robert took this at 1/1600th of a second, so very, very sharp, fast shutter speed, and that's what's allowed him to kind of just grab everything sharp. So Robert goes on. So yeah, difficult to take and get the composition right when the cab is moving and the bike is moving, but I rather like the shot. I think it might have been better if to have more room up the front of the picture instead of the back, but I kind of like it this way. Can you give me your take on it, and what do I need to do to improve the edit? Also, I have no idea why the edited version is over 200 megabytes. Yes, Robert emailed me this, and the edited version was 200 megabytes, big massive file, but it was a PNG file, a PNG file, rather than a JPEG. First of all, the PNG files are great for small things, they're kind of a replacement for a GIF. Great for little icons, really small pictures, but they do tend to be memory heavy, and when you go big, and you're talking an 45 megapixel photo, PNGs just aren't good for that. The other thing is when I went and checked the image you sent me, it was in 16-bit per channel. Now, for anybody who doesn't understand this, don't worry about it. I'll get past it in a moment. But it's worth understanding that... Okay, let me just show you. If I let's drag Robert's picture into here. There's a bit here. Now what I've done, I've turned this into a JPEG, and up in Photoshop there's a bit where you've got image mode, and under mode over here there's 8 bits per channel and 16 bits per channel. And 16 bits per channel is massively much, it's not just double, I think it ends up being sort of quadruple. It's one of these kind of exponential things. It's massively more detailed than, or more information in it than in an 8-bit. Now for printing up purposes, for what the eye can see, everything else, 8-bit is perfectly good enough. Sometimes for editing purposes, if you're getting banding problems, something I'll maybe deal with in a different one, you might go to 16-bit. But the thing is your picture was saved as 16-bit as a ping, and that's what made what would normally have been a sort of 5 megapixel or maximum 10 megapixel photo into a 200 megapixel photo. No more information to look at, but in terms of your file size, it ended up massive. So hopefully, Robert, that makes a little bit of sense for you. Okay, so back to the actual picture itself, this being the edited one, and now I'll just open this one as the original, and let's just open that with Photoshop as well. So you can see that basically from the original to that Roberts brightened it up a little bit and given a little bit of probably moved the texture slider, I would think, or the clarity slider a little bit, just to kind of make it a little bit sharper. So, what are my thoughts on this then? Are there ways that you could sort of play with it? Now, I think really the first of all, I mean, I think to notice it, to grab it out of the cab window while you're going, is a really amazing bit. That's quick thinking. You've got 1600th of a second. It's a good kind of speed which counteracts the fact that the car's moving, the bike is moving, and everything else. It's allowed you to capture everything really sharp. So that's good. Composition wise, there's a whole bunch of things with this that you could do. In a way, I think it suffers a little bit from that too close or too far. And also there is the bit about the idea of the bike moving into the picture rather than moving out of the picture. So probably the easiest thing to do, let's just show you what I mean by this. Okay, actually I'll tell you what, let's just change the workspace over to that so I'm not blocking off half of this. So we've got our picture here. Now if I go to here and we move your guy to the right, and then I'm going to use content aware to fill in space in front of him. So the content aware has just kind of filled that in based on what was already sitting there. Then what we see here is we've now got room for the bicycle to move into, and that kind of feels slightly more, rather than from that, where when we've got this, what happens is we follow the direction of the gaze. So we look at this guy on the bike, we follow his eyes forward, and essentially we ignore what's behind him. When we were talking about containment the other week, in essence, we've got a barrier here by the way his back comes down and the fact that we tend to follow the eyes of a person in a photo. So the whole photo only gets summed up in this, and what that means is this entire half of the photo is wasted. It's just nobody's looking over there. Whereas when you redo that kind of move them over to here, then what happens is now that containment line, let's just do that on a separate line, is here, so it doesn't matter if we just lose a little bit at the back, and most of the picture is now in front, and this is, so it feels like a much bigger photo. The cyclist is moving into the frame, and this is why, generally speaking, when you've got a walker, a rider, a driver, a moving object, generally speaking, you want to have more space in front of them than behind them. The only exception to this would be is if there's a stronger narrative happening in the background. So if we go back to here, and if you happen to have had say, some kind of interesting exchange. You had a couple of people standing on the pavement over here having an argument, or giving each other a bag of crisps or chips or chocolates, or having a fight or anything. You know, if you'd had something going on over here, then you've created a different narrative. You've got, because then you've got, and then this person here going past on the bike, oblivious to what's going on there, means you've got a dual story going in within the picture. And I think you can get away with that. Otherwise, what you've got is a lot of empty space, which kind of feels like it needs something to fill or is irrelevant. And if it's irrelevant, it means you need that space on the other side. So, I mean, it's not a bad photo, but if you're talking about taking it up to the next level, that's really kind of what you want to do. The other bit with this is the idea of, and obviously you're going from a moving cab, so it's not really possible, but if I just duplicate that for a moment, is where what we do is you have a much bigger photo. So at this point, what we're trying to do, you see, there is a bit of background, but we're not getting a huge amount of background here. We're not necessarily completely sure. Whereas if you get something more like this, and I know this is going to make a pig's ear of it, but just to give you a sense of the shape rather than necessarily what autofill Photoshop is going to put into something this big. That's not like it. There we go. Yeah. Okay, imagine the roads carrying on over here and the building is going up. But you can see that this kind of thing then is giving us much more of a sense of cyclist in the environment, and the environment itself becomes a really important part of the narrative. So that's kind of what you're up against. I think when you've got this, you either need something that's going on in the background, or you need a kind of bigger, more of the environment. Having the cyclist space to the front gives him more of an environment, but actually if you've got more of the building up and around and everything else, but again more in front, then you can have a much better sense of the environment, and I think that then becomes more of the narrative that you're after for the cyclist. In terms of the editing side of it, there's not huge amounts to edit. It might be fairly subtle. If you're wanting to, let's go back to that. If you're wanting to kind of make it look, you say it's just past the golden hour, but the shadows are still fairly long. What you could do if you want is, say you go to the hue saturation side of it, choose your yellows and up the saturation just a little bit. Something like that gives it a sort of slightly more, but if it kind of feels overkill on that, what you could even do is, sorry, turn that black. No, hold on. Paint bucket, that's what I want. Right. And then just take a brush and turning that back to white, paint in the kind of highlights where the sun is actually hitting the front of him. Wherever it's lit up, then paint that sort of slightly more exaggerated yellow, so you could just, you know, touch it up on the road, something like that, and then that way it's just a subtle thing, but it makes it makes the yellows look a little bit more golden. For that matter, if in between that, what would I do? Say take the curves. I just sort of want to darken down the background a little bit, because the background's sort of slightly less important. But again, in this case, but just lighten him back up so we can kind of see a little bit more what's going on. Just kind of do something like that. So that the background is, so it's more about him in the light than it is. So if I group those, you can see the difference then between, you know. So hopefully then, Robert, that gives you something to sort of play around with, some ideas with that. What have we got? So a few more comments here. Russ says, I agree, Robert, more room up the front of the bike to move into would help. Rosemary says, the space behind the bike makes me ask, what is this fellow racing away from? Is he late, being chased? That gives a unique open-ended story. So, I mean, it's an interesting point. There is a sort of sense, but I think at that point you still need to have something going on behind. Robert says that was very helpful. Remember changing the channel when I was editing that day. Rosemary says the simplicity of the right side does draw our eye to the bike. Would be interesting to see it again with more in front of the fellow, and I think that was probably just before I moved it. Andy says difficult from a moving car, but panning always works well to add movement to a cyclist shot and blur the background. Yeah, now that's a trick which takes a lot of practice, and at that point harder to do from a moving object to a moving object, but something to try perhaps sometimes from the side of a road. Follow an object with your camera, and what you do is you do a normal shutter speed, or you don't go super fast. You do something like 125th of a second or something, or 100th of a second, or even slower if you think you can do it. But what you try and do is you try and move the camera with the object itself, with the bicycle or the car as it's moving, so that the object stays in focus, but then the background becomes gets a movement blur to it. But it does take practice. You do need to practice to do that a lot. It's not one that just happens very easily. What else we got? Jack says that makes so much sense. Thank you. We'll try and remember that. Robert says for street photography in Paris, I found that taking photos from a cab was extremely fun. You have to think fast and see a lot of variety in a short time. Also, you make a quick getaway. Yeah, I suppose there's that with street photography. You're never entirely sure how anybody's going to react to you pointing the camera at them. If you're in a cab, you're gone before they can. Andy says, I like the idea of drive-by street photography. It could be a whole new genre. Rosemary says, I love the light in this shot. And Robert says, agreed, Andy, you should try it. It is fun. You miss more great shots than you get, but you will get a lot. It's like trying to capture a movie. All my cab rides were little gold mines of photos. But then street photography is like that anyway. Your hit rate with street photography is always going to be fairly low. Generally speaking, by the time you've spotted something interesting, it's gone. So you have to learn a sort of certain sense of anticipation and very fast reactions. 9 times out of 10 you're not going to get it, but every now and again you will get a little nugget, and that's the kind of fun of street photography. Right, okay, so thank you very much for sending that one in, Robert. So next on, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about Andy's photo. Now Andy sent in a lovely image which of this one here. Now just aware, actually my head's cutting off half the image, which is a shame with this one. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to open that one in Photoshop just so that you can see it a little bit better. So you've got a full sense of the photo here. And Andy says, this is an image of members of the 4 Aces Teddy Boys taken at the Austin Sports and Social Club in Longbridge, Birmingham. I've been photographing Teddy Boys for 6 years, and I like this intimate moment caught in the bar of this working men's club. And yeah, I would say at this point, in fact, Andy, if you want to put your web address, I think it's andyhollowayphoto.com or .co.uk, I can't remember, but if you want to put it in the comments here, I would recommend to anybody else to go and take a look at Andy's website, because he's got some fantastic photos of these teddy boys, just teddy boys who grew up, teddy boys who are known, have all become older men, but these guys meet up, they dress up, they go for their hairstyles and all the rest of it. And Andy's been following them for several years and has got some fantastic photos, some really nice street photos and portraits of them on his website. Well worth going and checking out. So Andy sent me this. I asked him for a little bit more information, and he said, I'm toying with the idea of entering this into a club competition, so it would be good to get some technical judge style feedback. It's also not a traditional club competition image, although I see an unguarded moment captured. Do you think this intent comes across? So unguarded moment, yeah, what we've got here is we do have this lovely point. Whatever joke was suddenly cracked, we've got this guy here, laughing. He's got, holding back the, you can see the smile in his face. he's probably just said something which is what's made him laugh, and then the other guys here all leaning across. So instead of a kind of posed photo where everybody's sort of sitting in a line or staring at the camera, they're all reacting to this guy laughing, which is a lovely touch. It sort of adds that real sense of humanity and puts a smile on our face and takes us into the photo. We now connect with these people rather than just being complete voyeurs. We kind of feel like, oh, there's a joke, and we're kind of getting ready to find out and join in with the joke. So I then asked about the setup or what he was doing, and Andy said, I was running a pop-up studio to photograph portraits of individual Teds. So in this Working Man's Club, Andy has set up a little kind of pop-up studio, a couple of softboxes, or a single key light softbox with a smaller softbox for fill. This was a last-minute request as I was packing up to photograph all four Ayres Teds all together. I picked an area that was relatively clear and placed the light at either side of the group and pumped the power on the lights. Exposure was by trial and error. Yeah, exposure is always by trial and error. You go click, you look in the back of the camera, go, oh, lighten that up, darken that down. I think the days of when you have to walk around and go and set everything up with a light meter have been superseded by the fact you can go click and you can instantly see in the back of the camera whether you've got the light levels right. So clearly then what Andy's been doing is he's been taking individual portraits. He set up the place in the bar to create, that's his like studio for doing these individual portraits, and then somebody said, oh, could we get a group photo? And so quick setup, light at either end, whack the power up to full. And by whacking up the power to full, what he's managed to get as well, I don't have your readings for this, Andy, but the fact that what we've got is it's clearly in focus at the front of the table, it's in focus on the guys, and it's in focus sort of behind as well. Means that I would guess you're probably using something like a minimum of an f11, maybe even an f16, which is quite a narrow aperture, but it does allow you to have that depth. But because it's a narrow aperture, you've then got to really whack the lights up on full to be able to get enough light into the lens. And the fact that they're not distorted, even though he's laughing, means that you've still got a little bit of speed in your shutter speed as well. Because if you've gone too slow with that, they would have gone a bit out of focus. So overall, really good settings on your camera to capture everything you're wanting. So in terms of that kind of technical with what you're doing with the lights and lenses and settings, you know what you're doing. You know, there's nothing that I can really say there, which is, you know, I'm not going to turn around and say, well, you should have maybe tried this aperture or that shutter speed. Whatever you were doing, you've nailed it. They're all in focus. You've captured them. So the next thing then is about what might you have done to elevate this photo to the next level up? I mean, on an initial, just as we look at it, it delivers, you know, and you have caught that moment. We do have that laughter going on, and we've got the faces there. However, the first thing, but in terms of a staged photo or a photo of a bunch of guys in a working man's club, there are bits where I feel if you'd really had time to stage this rather than it just being a tag on at the last moment, somebody said, quick, get a shot of the guys together, but actually you thought, well, let's get a proper shot of where they're really interacting with each other. I think that maybe the staging of it would have been slightly different. The two things that strike me in particular about this is, first of all, is that they're all very much in a long line. And actually, when you're sitting in a pub, if they're all together in a pub, they wouldn't be. You know, they'd be sat around the table. Now, obviously, when you've got that problem, you've always got a problem that there's going to be one or two people with their backs to you, and that's not necessarily part of the photo. But even if you had them sort of curved around a bit, and you had sort of a couple of people inside of the chairs or what have you, and or maybe somebody starting to stand up or somebody coming back, putting a pint down on the table in front of. So I think that notion of sort of staging people with a little bit more depth, rather than sort of flat in a line, but forward and back, and having people kind of to the sides of the table, to the front of the table, it would take a little bit of playing around with, but you've got an eye for this, Andy, and I've no doubt you could probably create something. So I think, so that's the first thing that strikes me, is the fact that they're all in a line, but that line itself doesn't particularly feel natural, because if they were all sitting in the pub together, they wouldn't really sit in that way. The other thing that strikes me, again, if you're kind of trying to go for that sense of an authenticity, there's not enough beer. Quite simply, there's not enough beer and glasses. That if you've got the guys meeting together and they're meeting in the pub or the working man's club, and you know there would be, I mean, at the moment you've got 3 bottles of Nuki Brown with, you know, and 1 glass, and for a bunch of guys in a pub, that just is unnatural. For those of you in watching from the States, I mean, you won't, in a British man's working club, you're not going to have a waitress coming round. It's not just a case of the waiter or waitress hasn't delivered their beer yet. You don't do that. One of these guys would have gone up to the bar, bought a round, brought everybody's stuff back. You would then expect actually that there would have been 2 or 3 or 4 rounds in. You would have found a few glasses on the table, a couple of empty or semi-empty bottles, and I think that's kind of really, I think, if you can kind of think about that sense of more authenticity. It's not, I mean, a stage photo is never authentic in that sense, but what you're trying to do is create a story which has a feel of authenticity. And if you're creating that story, then that story needs to kind of be reflected in, you know, so that notion of how would these guys sit if you had turned up and captured them in the pub, because that's the, if you like, the narrative of this is this idea that we're not looking at this thinking, oh right, how's he set up the lighting, apart from the fact, well, as photographers we might be, but for anybody else looking at this photo, it's not about what the lighting is. The conceit is you've turned up to the pub, there's a bunch of guys sitting down, you've taken their photo, you've managed to capture this guy just as he's burst into laughter, probably because of what this guy said. And everybody else is sort of leaning around watching what's coming in, or watching the laughter or reacting to it. But it's just that the stage itself is less convincing. And I understand how this happens because you've been doing the individual portraits and it's quick, let's get a shot of everybody together. So everybody goes and sits in a line. You're rushing, there's a whole 10,000 other things running through your head. So you take the photo of your line and you're really lucky. You manage to catch them while they're making a joke and you get that lovely authentic moment. I think another way of doing this, I don't know how big your original photo was, but because they're so spread out, I'd be tempted, if you're wanting to go for that kind of the club competition style of thing, is actually, much though I love all these guys, and these guys over on the right here are all reacting to him, I think the real story is here. And actually, if you come in closer to kind of these 3 guys, then the fact that there's 2 bottles on the table here, you've got a glass up here, and actually, because his hand is down here, if you kind of crop almost like that, something like that, so he's half out of the picture, you're just going to naturally assume there's probably another bottle over on the right or something like that. Or if you felt really handy with your Photoshop skills, you take that Newcastle Brown Ale bottle and stick it here. Or that one, depending on which one you think will blend into the background a bit better. But in a way, I think something like that is maybe where you could go for the composition, and this then does actually feel like you've caught the moment, because you could quite easily have the 3 guys on the bench, on the seats together, with a couple of bottles and glasses around, and it doesn't feel as staged as this, where you've got the whole lot. So I hope that gives you some ideas there, Andy. I mean, it's a great photo, you know, and you have definitely caught that sense of energy and humour between the guys. But so all I'm doing here is kind of offering up, I think, if you had the opportunity, if you were back there again and you wanted to have a kind of full groups thing, think more about the setting and how you might stage it completely. And if you're talking about the kind of club competition, maybe cut out the guys that are on the right of the photo and concentrate on the 3 where the real story is happening, and you might get away with that kind of feeling of being a bit more, you've caught that moment, and not worrying too much about the rest of them. So, hope that makes sense. Right, okay, we've got quite a bit of feedback on this. So what have we got here? Rosemary says, love the light in this shot. Robert says, agreed, Andy, you should... oh yeah, that was about the... Sorry, going back a bit here. That was about Robert's Paris shot. April says, nice documentary photo. Robert says, what a great and fun shot. Jolly bunch of guys. Rosemary says, this is a fun capture. I wonder about cropping off half the gentleman on the far right and correcting the lens distortion. Wooden styles fanning out rather than true vertical. So yeah, actually, so Rosemary's suggesting kind of what I was suggesting there at the end. Andy says, yes, agree, need to do some more work on this. Meg says, really good photo. Stacey says, this is funny, not having waitresses. You are correct about tables. Although smaller places with not so many tables, people bring the beer to their own tables. Yeah, it's a standard thing, Stacey, in Britain. Unless you're at more of a kind of a certain kind of... Well, if you're at a restaurant, fine, you have the waitress come over, but standard bar, you go to the bar, you buy your drink, or you buy drinks for everybody, and then you go and sit down with them. April says, I like it with 3 guys cropped. Andy says, yep, that works much better. John says, I agree with April. Andy says, thanks for the feedback. April says, definitely more details with the 3, the tattoos, etc. Yeah, I think that's maybe another interesting point. That's a good point there, April. Is that when you come in on the 3, that you do get more of that sense of the detail. Although, having said that, I mean, the point of the group shot is then it's not just... if you've already been doing individual portraits, you will have been bringing out the detail of the hair and the attitude and the clothes and the little details and the tattoos and the studs and the whatever else is in there. What's nice about a group shot is that you then get the variations of that. The fact that each of these teddy boys has paid meticulous detail to the individuality of their own outfit, and it's really nice then getting that combination of them together. But yeah, I think certainly the 3 of them would work together. Right, okay, so thank you ever so much, Andy, for sending that one in. It's always fun. It's great getting nice fun to get my kind of teeth into and kind of explore other ideas. So next week then, quick reminder that we're going to do the idea of your DIY equipment, your DIY photo equipment. Most people have had a go at doing something, even if it's a case of a bit of aluminium foil on a piece of card to act as a reflector, or a cigarette paper over the end of a flash, or whatever. If you've got a piece like that, take a photo of it, send it to us along with a photo of where you've used it so we can see the effect, and tell us a little bit about it. And if you haven't had a go onto YouTube, find something which you think, oh, I've got to give that a go, give it a go, and then send us the results for the same thing. And we'll look at all those next week. Meanwhile, if you found these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them in some way, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is certainly one of the ways you can do that. So I look forward to seeing what everybody's going to come up with next week. And yeah, that should be a lot of fun. So I think, yeah, is that us? Is there any last minute bits and pieces? Don't think so. Right, take care, have fun, look forward to seeing what you're going to come up with next week. Cheerio.